Most people never notice when it starts. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is obvious, but because it looks normal. Someone asks why you pulled away, why you were quiet, why you said no, why you changed your mind. And almost instantly, something in you begins to explain. You explain your mood, your boundaries, your distance, your decision, your tone, your timing, and it sounds harmless, polite even. But in many people, this is not simple communication. It is something much deeper. It is fear. Carl Jung understood that one of the clearest signs of a fractured inner center is the inability to stand inside your own experience without needing it approved from the outside. In other words, the constant need to explain yourself is rarely about clarity. It is usually about permission. Permission to feel what you feel. Permission to choose what you choose. Permission to disappoint someone. Permission to exist without being misread. And that pattern usually begins early. A child feels hurt. They are told they are too sensitive. A child feels anger. They are told they are disrespectful. A child feels fear. They are told they are overreacting. So the child learns something dangerous. My experience is not real until someone else confirms it. And that belief does not disappear in adulthood. It matures. It becomes over-explaining, over-clarifying, over-defending, a quiet compulsion to make yourself understandable enough to avoid rejection. But what looks like communication is often self-abandonment, because every time you feel forced to justify your inner reality, you move one step further away from your own authority. This is the pattern, and the cost is bigger than most people realize. Because the person who keeps explaining themselves is not just speaking too much. They are unconsciously putting their identity on trial. In this video, we're going to look at why that happens, what Jung saw beneath it, and why the moment you stop explaining yourself, your entire psychological posture begins to change. Not because silence makes you cold, but because, for the first time, your existence is no longer being negotiated. This pattern does not begin in adulthood. It begins much earlier. Long before you had the language to describe what was happening, you were already learning something about your inner world. You were learning whether your feelings were allowed to exist on their own, or whether they had to be corrected, softened, explained, or denied. A child says, "That hurt me," and instead of being met, they are dismissed. "You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. That's not what happened. Stop being dramatic." A child feels anger, but anger is treated like disrespect. A child feels fear, but fear is treated like weakness. A child feels sadness, but sadness becomes inconvenience. So something starts to happen inside them. They stop trusting the original signal. They stop experiencing emotion as something real and start experiencing it as something that must be defended. This is where the split begins. Instead of feeling first and understanding later, the person learns to explain first so they can earn the right to feel it all. That is the wound. Not simply pain, not simply rejection, but the deeper conditioning that says, "What I feel is not valid by itself. I have to make it reasonable for other people first." And once that belief settles in, it does not stay in childhood. It follows you into adult relationships, into friendships, into work, into love, into every moment where your inner reality collides with someone else's expectations. Now when you say no, you feel pressure to explain it. Now when you pull away, you feel pressure to make it understandable. Now when something feels wrong, you do not simply trust the feeling. You build a case for it. You gather details. You rehearse your wording. You try to make your discomfort sound legitimate enough to be accepted, because deep down, part of you still believes the same old thing. If I cannot make my experience understandable, maybe I do not have the right to stand by it. This is why over-explaining feels automatic. It is not just communication. It is adaptation. It is the adult version of a child trying to stay emotionally safe in an environment where being real had consequences. And the tragedy is that many people carry this pattern for years without ever naming it. They think they are being mature, thoughtful, fair, open, but often they are doing something far more painful. They are abandoning their first truth in order to make it more acceptable. This is the pattern, and once you see it clearly, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. A large part of what you call explaining yourself is actually an old survival strategy, not a choice, not a preference, a strategy, which means the real question is no longer, how do I explain myself better? The real question is, why did I learn that I had to? And once that question becomes real, the entire structure starts to shake. Because now you are no longer just looking at a habit. You are looking at a personality organized around avoiding disapproval. And that is where Jung becomes essential. Because for Jung, healing was never just about changing behavior. It was about facing the hidden structure underneath it. In the next section, we'll go deeper into that structure and look at what over-explaining actually costs you over time. Because the damage is not only social, it is psychological. It changes the way you relate to your own mind. At first, this pattern feels useful. It helps you avoid conflict. It keeps situations smooth. It makes other people more comfortable. And because of that, it gets rewarded. People describe you as reasonable, easy to talk to, emotionally intelligent. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. Something much quieter. Every time you explain yourself to avoid discomfort, you move slightly away from what you actually felt. Not dramatically. Not all at once, but enough. You soften your tone. You adjust your reasoning. You reshape your truth just enough to make it acceptable. And in that moment, something subtle happens. You stop expressing your experience and start managing how it will be received. This is where the shift occurs. From living to performing. You are no longer speaking from your center. You are speaking from anticipation, trying to predict reactions, trying to avoid misinterpretation, trying to control how you are seen. And the more you do this, the more disconnected you become from your original signal. Because your attention is no longer on what is true, it is on what will be accepted. This is the cost. And it builds slowly. You begin to doubt your own reactions. You second-guess your boundaries. You question your instincts. You hesitate before saying something simple and true. Not because you do not know what you feel, but because you no longer trust that it is enough on its own. So you add explanations. You justify your tone, your timing, your decision, your distance, until your truth no longer feels like something you stand in. It feels like something you have to defend. This is where exhaustion begins. Not physical exhaustion, psychological exhaustion. The kind that comes from constantly monitoring yourself, from constantly adjusting, from constantly translating your inner world into something that will not cause friction. And over time, something even deeper starts to form. Resentment. Because part of you begins to notice the imbalance. You are always explaining, always clarifying, always making things easier for others to understand, but rarely being met with the same effort. Rarely being taken as you are. Rarely being trusted without explanation. And this creates a quiet internal tension. You start to feel unseen, even while being understood, which is a very different thing. Because being understood often comes after you reshape yourself. But being seen happens when you don't. This is the fracture Jung was pointing to. The ego begins to organize itself around adaptation. Instead of truth, instead of asking, "What is real for me?" it starts asking, "What version of this will be accepted?" And once that becomes the default, you lose something essential. Not your voice, but your authority over it. This is the pattern, and this is why Jung would not see over-explaining as politeness, but as a form of self-abandonment. Not loud, not dramatic, but repeated so often, it becomes identity. In the next section, we'll look at the turning point. What actually happens when you stop doing this? Because the moment you stop explaining yourself, you are not just changing behavior. You are shifting the entire center of your psyche. At some point, the pattern becomes visible. Not all at once, not as a sudden realization, but in small moments. You hear yourself explaining something simple, and it feels unnecessary. You notice the extra sentences, the added justification, the need to make your decision make sense to someone who didn't even ask. And for a second, something in you pauses. Why am I explaining this? That moment is the beginning. Because once you see the pattern, you can't fully unsee it. And slowly, something starts to shift. Not in what you say, but in where you speak from. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to hold the impulse. You feel the urge to explain, but you don't follow it immediately. You let it sit. And in that space, something unfamiliar appears. Discomfort, a quiet tension in the body, a subtle anxiety, the feeling that if you don't explain, something might go wrong. They might misunderstand you. They might judge you. They might pull away. This is the real threshold, not communication, not behavior. Fear, the fear that your experience on its own will not be enough. And this is exactly where Jung's idea of individuation begins to become real. Because individuation is not about becoming different. It is about becoming internally grounded, without needing constant confirmation from the outside. Which means this moment, when you choose not to explain, is not small. It is structural. You are no longer organizing yourself around how you are perceived. You are beginning to stand in what is true, even if it is not understood. This is the emergence of something new. Internal authority. Not arrogance. Not detachment. Not indifference. Authority. The ability to say, "This is what I feel. This is what I choose. This is where I stand," without needing to build a case for it, without needing approval to hold it, without needing someone else to agree before you can trust it. And at first, this feels unnatural, even wrong, because for years, your system has been trained to associate safety with explanation. So when you stop explaining, your mind tries to pull you back. Just clarify it. Just make it easier. Just say one more sentence. But this is where the shift deepens. Because instead of obeying that impulse, you stay. You let the silence exist. You let the other person interpret, misinterpret, react. And you remain where you are, not to prove something, but to stop negotiating your own reality. This is the turning point. Because for the first time, your experience is no longer being translated into something acceptable. It is simply being held, and something unexpected begins to happen. Your words become fewer, but heavier, more precise, more direct, more real, because they are no longer filtered through fear. They come from alignment. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the center of the psyche shifting from the outside back to the inside, from reaction to position, from explanation to presence. And once that shift begins, you don't just communicate differently, you exist differently. In the next section, we'll look at what happens externally when this internal shift takes place. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself, people don't just hear you differently, they start responding to you differently. The first thing that changes is not you. It's how people respond to you. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself, you interrupt a pattern that others have become used to. A pattern where you clarify, where you soften, where you make things easier. And when that disappears, people notice. Not always consciously, but they feel it. You say less. You don't rush to justify. You don't fill the silence. And that silence does something. It creates tension. Because many relationships are built on predictable reactions. You explain. They evaluate. You adjust. They respond. It's a loop. And when you step out of that loop, the dynamic breaks. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. People may question you more. Why are you being like this? Is something wrong? Can you explain what you mean? And you feel the old impulse rise again. To clarify, to smooth it over, to return to what is familiar. But if you don't, if you hold your position without adding unnecessary explanation, something else begins to happen. People start to recalibrate. Because without your over-explaining, they have less to work with, less to analyze, less to control, less to reinterpret. And this is where things become very clear. The people who were relating to you through control, expectation, or subtle pressure struggle because they relied on your need to be understood. They relied on your openness to correction, your willingness to adjust, your habit of making yourself make sense. Without that, their influence weakens, and sometimes they react, not because you did something wrong, but because the dynamic no longer benefits them. This is important to see clearly. When you stop explaining yourself, some people will feel uncomfortable, not because you became difficult, but because you became less available for manipulation, less available for negotiation, less available for being shaped. And this reveals something that was always there, but hidden. Which relationships were based on mutual respect, and which ones were based on your flexibility? Because real connection does not require constant explanation. It allows space. It allows difference. It allows misunderstanding without immediate correction. But relationships built on control need clarity, need justification, need access to your reasoning so they can influence it. So when that access disappears, the relationship either evolves or it weakens. This is why stopping over-explaining can feel like losing people. But what you are actually losing is a role, a version of yourself that was easier to manage, easier to predict, easier to influence, and in its place, something more stable begins to form. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more defined. You are no longer participating in every emotional exchange. You are no longer reacting to every expectation. You are no longer explaining your existence to maintain connection. You are simply present. And that presence carries weight, because it is not trying to convince anyone. It is not asking to be accepted. It is not adjusting itself to fit. It is just there. And that changes everything. Because people don't just respond to words. They respond to structure, to certainty, to boundaries, to the absence of negotiation. In the next section, we'll go deeper into what this creates internally. Because what looks like silence on the outside is actually the beginning of something much more important on the inside: integration. the moment where you stop managing how you are perceived and start fully inhabiting who you are. After the shift, something stabilizes. Not immediately, not perfectly, but noticeably. You stop reacting as quickly. You stop explaining as often. You stop feeling responsible for how every word lands. And in that space, something begins to form. A center, not a loud one, not something you announce, but something you feel, a quiet sense that you no longer need to adjust yourself in every interaction. This is where psychological integrity begins. Not as an idea, but as a way of being. Jung saw this as one of the clearest signs of individuation. When a person is no longer divided between what they feel and what they show, no longer split between their internal experience and the version of themselves they present to be accepted. Instead, there is alignment. What you feel and what you express begin to move together. And because of that, something changes in how you speak. You no longer talk to convince. You talk to express. You don't build arguments to defend your position. You state it. You don't explain your boundaries in long sequences. You hold them. You don't try to make everything understandable. You allow it to be true, even if it isn't. This is a completely different posture, and people feel it immediately. Because most communication is not about words. It's about certainty. When someone speaks from doubt, it creates space for negotiation. When someone speaks from alignment, it closes that space. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but naturally. This is why fewer words start to carry more weight, because they are no longer inflated by fear. They are grounded. There is no hidden question underneath them. No silent, "Is this okay?" No subtle request for approval. Just clarity. And that clarity creates something most people are not used to. Presence. A kind of presence that does not rush to fill silence, does not rush to correct misunderstanding, does not rush to smooth tension. It stays. And because it stays, it begins to reshape how others respond. Conversations slow down. People become more careful with their assumptions. Certain dynamics lose their grip entirely because they depended on your uncertainty to function. And now that uncertainty is no longer there. This is the paradox. The less you try to be understood, the more seriously you are taken. The less you justify your position, the more solid it appears. Not because you are forcing respect, but because you are no longer weakening your own position from the inside. This is integrity, not perfection, not rigidity, coherence, the ability to remain internally consistent, even when the external situation pressures you to bend, even when someone expects more explanation, even when silence creates discomfort. You remain, and over time, something deeper settles. You stop asking yourself, "Am I being reasonable? Will they understand? Should I explain this better?" And start asking something else. "Is this true for me?" That becomes the reference point. And once that shift is established, your entire relationship with yourself changes. You trust your reactions more. You hesitate less. You recover faster from doubt. Because your experience is no longer something you question first. It is something you stand in. And from that place, communication becomes simpler, cleaner, more honest. Not because you learned new techniques, but because you remove the need to constantly defend yourself. This is where most people start to notice something subtle but powerful. You don't feel smaller in conversations anymore. You don't feel like you have to earn your place. You don't feel like you have to explain your way into being accepted. You already are. And that changes everything. In the final section, we'll bring this together. Because once this integrity becomes stable, the world does not respond to you the same way anymore. Not because you demanded it, but because something in you is no longer negotiable. At a certain point, you notice something strange. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You didn't defend your position. And yet, the situation changed. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped participating in it the same way. You stopped offering explanations where they weren't needed. You stopped softening what was already clear. You stopped trying to make your existence easier for others to accept. And in that absence, something new appeared. Clarity, not the kind you explain, the kind you hold. This is where everything comes together. Because the real shift was never about speaking less. It was about standing differently. You are no longer organizing yourself around how you are perceived. You are no longer anticipating reactions before you even express yourself. You are no longer negotiating your inner reality to maintain connection. You are simply there. And that presence communicates more than any explanation ever could. People feel it, even if they don't understand it, because for the first time, your words are not carrying insecurity underneath them. They are not trying to secure approval. They are not trying to prevent rejection. They are just aligned. And that alignment changes how the world responds. Some people will respect you more. Some people will step back. Some relationships will become quieter. Others will become more real. And a few will disappear completely. But what remains is different, cleaner, less forced, less dependent on you being understood at all times. Because connection no longer comes from how well you explain yourself. It comes from how honestly you exist. This is the part most people avoid, because it requires letting go of something familiar. The habit of proving yourself. The reflex of justifying your choices. The need to be seen in a very specific way, and replacing it with something far less controllable. Truth. Not polished. Not perfectly articulated. Not always understood. But yours. And once you begin to live from that place, something settles. You stop feeling like you are being evaluated in every interaction. You stop feeling like you have to earn your position. You stop feeling like your presence needs to be explained, because it no longer does. You are not here to be interpreted correctly by everyone. You are not here to be approved in every moment. You are not here to make your inner world easy to accept. You are here to be it, fully, without translation, without negotiation, without permission. And that is where the real change happens. Not in how much you say, but in what you no longer feel the need to say. So the next time you feel that impulse, to explain, to justify, to make yourself clearer than necessary, pause and ask yourself something simple. Is this expression or is this defense? Because that question alone can change everything. And the more often you choose not to defend your existence, the more you realize something that was always true. You never needed permission to be who you are. You only learned to believe that you did.